June 17, 1943, 7:32 p.m. The Crystal Room Restaurant on 125th Street and Lenox Avenue, located in the heart of Harlem, but owned and operated by Michael Patrick O'Sullivan, a 47-year-old Irish immigrant from Boston who had purchased the establishment in 1939 and who maintained a whites-only service policy despite the fact that Harlem was 89% black by 1943, and despite the fact that his restaurant depended on black customers' money while simultaneously refusing to allow those same customers to sit at his tables and be served like human beings rather than like second-class citizens who should be grateful for whatever scraps white business owners chose to provide them, was experiencing its usual Thursday evening rush of white customers from downtown Manhattan who came to Harlem seeking the neighborhood's famous jazz music and nightlife, but who preferred to dine in establishments that maintained racial segregation because they believed that eating alongside black people would be degrading and inappropriate and contrary to the natural social order that kept races separate and unequal. The restaurant featured white tablecloths, crystal chandeliers imported from France, a full bar stocked with expensive whiskey and wine that had become scarce during wartime rationing, and a menu that offered steaks, lobster and other luxury foods that were nearly impossible to obtain in 1943 when the entire nation was focused on supporting the war effort overseas and when most Americans were making do with limited resources and government-issued ration cards. O'Sullivan stood near the entrance, greeting customers as they arrived, a role he enjoyed because it allowed him to personally determine who would be permitted to enter his establishment and who would be turned away, a power that he exercised almost exclusively to exclude black customers unless they were celebrities like Duke Ellington or Billie Holiday, whose fame made them exceptions to his general policy but who were still required to use the back entrance and sit in a designated section away from white patrons. He was a tall man over 6 feet, with graying red hair and the kind of thick Boston accent that marked him immediately as someone not native to New York, someone who had brought his racial attitudes from Massachusetts, where Irish immigrants like himself occupied an uncomfortable position in American society, discriminated against by wealthier Anglo-Saxon Protestants, but determined to distinguish themselves from black Americans by maintaining strict racial hierarchies that placed even poor Irish immigrants above the most accomplished black professionals or businessmen. O'Sullivan's restaurant had been profitable for 4 years, generating approximately $15,000 annually in net income, a substantial sum in 1943 when the average American worker earned less than $2,000 per year. And this financial success had convinced him that his whites-only policy was not just morally correct, but also economically sound because white customers appreciated his willingness to create a segregated space where they could enjoy Harlem's culture without having to interact with Harlem's black residents as equals. At 7:32 p.m., the front door of the Crystal Room opened and 4 black men entered the restaurant, moving with a kind of quiet confidence that immediately drew attention from everyone in the dining room. The first man through the door was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, 37 years old, wearing a charcoal gray suit that had cost $300 when he purchased it from a tailor on Fifth Avenue, a silk tie imported from Italy, and shoes that had been custom-made by a craftsman in Philadelphia who specialized in footwear. For wealthy clients who demanded perfection in every detail of their appearance, Bumpy stood 5 feet 9 inches tall, shorter than average, but carrying himself with a presence that made him seem larger, his posture straight, and his movements economical and precise in the way of someone who had spent decades navigating dangerous environments where careless gestures or unnecessary movements could get you killed or injured, or marked as weak and vulnerable to attack from rivals who were always watching for signs of decline or inattention. Behind Bumpy walked 3 associates who worked in his organization controlling Harlem's numbers, protection services, and various other illegal and semi-legal enterprises that generated hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, and that made Bumpy the most powerful black criminal in New York City, and one of the few black men in America who had negotiated a position of genuine equality with white organized crime figures, like Frank Costello and Lucky Luciano, who ran the Italian mob families that controlled much of the city's underworld economy. The 4 men stopped just inside the entrance, waiting to be greeted and seated in accordance with normal restaurant etiquette, their presence creating an immediate disruption in the dining room's atmosphere as white customers turned to stare in conversations, halted mid-sentence, while everyone processed the unexpected sight of well-dressed black men entering a whites-only establishment with the obvious expectation that they would be served like any other paying customers. Sullivan moved quickly to intercept them before they could proceed further into the restaurant, positioning himself between Bumpy and the dining room in a posture that communicated both physical barrier and social boundary. His face already reddening with anger or embarrassment or some combination of emotions that white men in 1943 typically experienced when confronted by black people who refused to accept their assigned subordinate status and who instead demanded treatment as equals despite centuries of American history and culture that insisted such equality was impossible and unnatural and contrary to God's plan for how different races should relate to each other. "I'm sorry, but we don't serve colored here," O'Sullivan said, his voice loud enough to be heard throughout the restaurant, loud enough to ensure that all of his white customers would know that he was enforcing his segregation policy and protecting them from the uncomfortable experience of dining alongside black patrons. He spoke with a kind of performative confidence that white business owners in 1943 typically displayed when exercising their legal right to discriminate, a confidence built on the knowledge that no law prohibited racial segregation in private businesses in New York, and that white public opinion overwhelmingly supported such discrimination as necessary and appropriate for maintaining social order and racial boundaries. "This is a private establishment, and I have the right to serve whoever I choose to serve. There are plenty of colored restaurants in Harlem where you can eat. This isn't one of them. I'm going to have to ask you to leave immediately before I call the police and have you removed for trespassing." O'Sullivan crossed his arms over his chest and widened his stance, body language designed to communicate immovability and determination, expecting that Bumpy and his associates would accept this rejection and leave quietly rather than create a scene that might escalate into violence or legal consequences that black men in 1943 understood would inevitably fall more heavily on them than on the white restaurant owner who was simply exercising his property rights. Bumpy stood completely still for approximately 15 seconds, his face showing no emotional reaction to O'Sullivan's words, his eyes scanning the dining room to observe how other customers were responding to this confrontation. He noticed that several white patrons were smiling or nodding in approval of O'Sullivan's stance, pleased to see a business owner willing to maintain racial boundaries and unwilling to capitulate to black demands for equal treatment. He noticed that two white men at a corner table had stopped eating and were watching intently, possibly preparing to assist O'Sullivan if this confrontation turned physical. He noticed that the restaurant's staff, all of them white, except for two black busboys who worked in the kitchen and who were not permitted to interact with customers, had stopped their work and were focused on what would happen next. And he noticed that O'Sullivan was performing for his audience, using this moment not just to exclude four black customers but to demonstrate to all of his white patrons that his restaurant would remain a segregated space where they could feel superior and protected from the kind of racial equality that was agonizingly slowly beginning to emerge in American society as black soldiers fought overseas in World War II while experiencing discrimination at home that made mockery of the democratic ideals that America claimed to be defending against fascism. After those 15 seconds of silence, Bumpy spoke in a voice that was quiet but that carried throughout the restaurant because of the absolute stillness that had descended on the dining room. A voice that communicated neither anger nor fear nor pleading, but rather a kind of calm certainty that people who knew Bumpy recognized as far more dangerous than raised voices or threats or displays of emotion. "Mr. O'Sullivan, I appreciate you being so clear about your policy. It's always useful when people state their positions directly rather than hiding behind polite excuses. Before you call the police, though, I think you should know something that might change your perspective on this situation. My name is Ellsworth Johnson. Most people in Harlem call me Bumpy. I assume you've heard that name during the 4 years you've been operating this restaurant in my neighborhood." Bumpy paused, watching O'Sullivan's face for recognition, seeing the moment when the name registered in O'Sullivan's confident expression began to shift into something less certain, something that suggested he was reassessing what he had assumed would be a simple matter of excluding unwanted customers. O'Sullivan's reputation as the owner of the Crystal Room had apparently not included detailed knowledge of who actually controlled Harlem's economy and what consequences might follow from disrespecting the man who had negotiated peace with the Italian mob after years of warfare over gambling territories, who had killed more than 40 people during his rise to power. who had the kind of connections to politicians and police and criminal organizations that made him effectively untouchable by normal law enforcement mechanisms. But even someone with limited knowledge of Harlem's underworld would recognize Bumpy Johnson's name, would understand that this was not an ordinary black customer who could be dismissed and forgotten, but rather someone whose displeasure could have serious and immediate consequences for a white business owner operating in a neighborhood where Bumpy's word carried more weight than law or custom or racial hierarchy. O'Sullivan, his arms uncrossed and his stance relaxed slightly, uncertainty replacing the performative confidence he had displayed moments earlier, his calculation shifting from how to exclude unwanted customers to how to manage a situation that had suddenly become much more complicated and potentially dangerous than a simple matter of enforcing segregation. "I don't care who you are," O'Sullivan said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier volume and certainty. "This is my restaurant. I built this business from nothing. I make the decisions about who eats here and who doesn't. You might be some big shot in the numbers racket or whatever it is you people do, but that doesn't give you the right to force your way into my establishment and demand service. I have property rights. I have the law on my side. You can threaten me all you want, but I'm not changing my policy. Now, please leave before this gets ugly for everyone involved." O'Sullivan's hand moved toward the telephone that sat on a podium near the entrance, a gesture meant to communicate his willingness to call police and have Bumpy arrested for trespassing, a threat that might have worked with other black customers who understood that police in 1943 would almost certainly side with a white business owner against black patrons, regardless of the facts or circumstances of the confrontation. Bumpy smiled, a small movement of his lips that didn't reach his eyes. A smile that the three men standing behind him recognized as the expression Bumpy made when he was about to destroy someone using words and knowledge rather than physical violence. "You're absolutely right that this is your restaurant, Mr. O'Sullivan. Or at least, it was your restaurant until 11:30 this morning. Let me explain what happened today, while you were here preparing for tonight's dinner service. So focused on your business that you apparently did unnotice certain changes in your legal and financial situation that are going to dramatically affect how you operate going forward." Bumpy reached into his jacket pocket, a movement that caused O'Sullivan to tense and step backward, possibly expecting a weapon. But Bumpy withdrew only a folded document that he opened carefully and held up so that O'Sullivan could see official-looking text and signatures and seals that marked it as some kind of legal paperwork. This morning at 11:30 a.m., a real estate company called Lennox Holdings LLC completed the purchase of this building from its previous owner, Mr. Abraham Steinberg, who has owned this property since 1935, and who has been your landlord for the past 4 years. Mr. Steinberg sold the building for $48,000, which is actually below market value, but he was motivated to sell quickly because Lennox Holdings offered all cash and agreed to complete the transaction immediately without the usual delays that come with bank financing and property inspections. Lennox Holdings now owns this building, which means they own your restaurant, or more precisely, they own the physical space that you're currently operating your restaurant within. I should mention that Lennox Holdings, LLC is a company that I created 3 weeks ago, specifically for the purpose of acquiring properties in Harlem that are currently owned by people who do not live in this neighborhood, and who do and particularly care about Harlem as residents, except as sources of rental income, or as customers, for businesses that discriminate against them while taking their money. Lennox Holdings LLC is registered in Delaware, managed by lawyers who handle all the paperwork, and funded entirely with money from my various business enterprises, which means, Mr. O'Sullivan, that, as of 11:30 this morning, I am your landlord. The dining room, which had been silent since Bumpy started speaking, somehow became even quieter as the implications of his words settled over the white customers who had been eating their expensive meals while congratulating themselves on dining in a whites-only establishment. O'Sullivan's face had gone from red to pale, his hand frozen halfway to the telephone, his mouth opening and closing without producing sound as he processed what Bumpy had just revealed. Bumpy continued, speaking in the same quiet, conversational tone, each word precise and calculated to maximize the psychological impact of the information he was delivering. "Now, I want to be very clear about what this means for you and your business. Your current lease agreement with Mr. Steinberg, which you signed in 1939, includes a clause that allows the property owner to terminate the lease with 30 days written notice if the tenant violates any terms of the agreement, or if the owner decides to use the property for different purposes. I've reviewed your lease very carefully over the past 3 weeks, while my lawyers were negotiating with Mr. Steinberg to purchase this building, and I can confirm that you are operating in full compliance with all the terms that Mr. Steinberg required. However, as the new owner, I have the legal right to impose additional requirements or to terminate your lease entirely and find a new tenant who would be more suitable for the kind of establishment I want to see operating in this building. Bumpy folded the document carefully and returned it to his jacket pocket, his movements unhurried and deliberate, allowing time for O'Sullivan and everyone else in the restaurant to fully comprehend the power shift that had just occurred. The sudden reversal of positions that had transformed a white business owner from someone who could reject black customers with impunity into someone who was now economically dependent on the very man he had just tried to exclude. Here's what's going to happen next. Mr. O'Sullivan, you're going to seat me and my associates at your best table, the one in the corner by the window that I notice is currently empty, despite the fact that your restaurant is quite busy tonight. You're going to personally take our order and ensure that we receive the same quality of service that you provide to your white customers. You're going to treat us with the respect that any paying customers deserve, and you're going to do so with a smile and with genuine hospitality, rather than with the kind of resentful minimum compliance that white business owners sometimes offer when they forced to serve black customers against their preferences. And after we've finished our meal and paid our bill and left your establishment, you're going to go home tonight and think very carefully about whether you want to continue operating a restaurant that discriminates against the very people who live in this neighborhood, because tomorrow morning my lawyers are going to deliver a formal letter informing you that your lease terms now include a non-discrimination clause that prohibits you from refusing service to any customer based on race or color. The silence in the dining room was absolute and suffocating, broken only by the faint sound of traffic on 125th Street and the distant music from a jazz club several blocks away. Every white patron in the Crystal Room sat frozen, forks halfway to mouths, wine glasses suspended in air conversations, interrupted mid-sentence, all of them witnessing a confrontation that violated every assumption they held about racial hierarchy and power dynamics, and who was supposed to defer to whom in American society in 1943. Several customers had stopped eating entirely, their meals forgotten, as they watched O'Sullivan struggle to formulate a response to Bumpy, a revelation that the confident white business owner who had just asserted his property rights and his legal authority to discriminate was now revealed to be nothing more than a tenant who could be evicted at any moment by the black gangster he had just tried to exclude from his restaurant. O'Sullivan stood motionless, his face cycling through expressions of shock and anger and fear and humiliation, his breathing shallow and rapid, his hands trembling slightly as the full implications of what had just occurred began to register in his consciousness, and as he realized that everything he thought he understood about his position and his power and his security had changed irrevocably in the space of 2 minutes. Bumpy waited patiently for O'Sullivan to respond, showing no impatience or aggression, simply standing near the entrance with his 3 associates behind him, all 4 men impeccably dressed and completely calm, their posture communicating that they had all the time in the world and that they were perfectly content to stand in the entrance of the Crystal Room for as long as necessary until O'Sullivan made a decision about how to proceed. The silence stretched to 30 seconds, then 45 seconds, approaching a full minute of absolute stillness, during which nobody in the restaurant moved or spoke or even seemed to breathe, everyone waiting to see whether O'Sullivan would capitulate or whether he would escalate this confrontation into something uglier and more dangerous that might result in violence or police intervention or some other resolution that would be witnessed and discussed and analyzed by Harlem residents for years to come as an example of what happened when white business owners tried to maintain Jim Crow segregation in a neighborhood where black people were developing the kind of economic and political power that made such discrimination increasingly costly and unsustainable. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was actually only 53 seconds according to the clock hanging on the wall near the bar, Sullivan spoke in a voice that had lost all of its earlier confidence and aggression and performative authority. "Follow me, please." The words came out quietly, barely audible, accompanied by a gesture toward the dining room that indicated Bumpy and his associates should proceed to be seated. O'Sullivan turned and walked into the restaurant without waiting to see if they were following, his shoulders slumped in a posture of defeat, his movements mechanical and wooden like someone operating on autopilot while their conscious mind tried to process trauma or shock or the kind of fundamental disruption to their worldview that occurs when reality contradicts everything they believe to be true and permanent and unquestionable. Bumpy followed at a measured pace, his associates falling into formation behind him. The four men moving through the dining room while white customers stared with expressions ranging from shock to outrage to something that might have been satisfaction at seeing a white racist publicly humiliated by the black man he had tried to exclude. O'Sullivan led them to the corner table by the window, exactly the location that Bumpy had specified. A prime position that offered views of both the street and the interior of the restaurant, and that would normally be reserved for O'Sullivan as most valued regular customers, or for white patrons, who had specifically requested the best seating. The table was set for four, covered with a white linen cloth, and decorated with fresh flowers and expensive crystal glassware and silver utensils that reflected the light from the chandelier hanging overhead. All of it arranged to create the kind of elegant atmosphere that wealthy white customers expected when dining at upscale establishments in Harlem. O'Sullivan pulled out chairs with trembling hands, his movements stiff and awkward as he performed service duties that he normally delegated to waitstaff, his face still pale and his breathing still irregular as he struggled to maintain some semblance of professional composure while simultaneously processing the catastrophic reversal of power that had just occurred. Once Bumpy and his associates were seated, O'Sullivan stood beside the table with a notepad and pen, waiting to take their order with a kind of forced attentiveness that service workers sometimes display when serving customers they resent but cannot afford to offend. "I'd like to start with a question," Bumpy said, his voice still quiet and conversational, his tones suggesting genuine curiosity rather than mockery or aggression. "You've been operating this restaurant in Harlem for 4 years. You've made a good living here. Built a successful business serving food to white customers who come to this neighborhood seeking entertainment and culture while maintaining your policy of excluding the black residents whose presence makes Harlem what it is. During those 4 years, did it ever occur to you that someone might object to this arrangement? Did you ever consider that maintaining a whites-only restaurant in a neighborhood that is 89% black might eventually create problems for you? Or did you simply assume that property rights and custom and racial hierarchy would protect you indefinitely, regardless of how Harlem's residents felt about being excluded from establishments in their own neighborhood?" Bumpy's questions were delivered without apparent anger or judgment, asked in the same tone someone might use to inquire about the weather or to make small talk about current events. But the content of the questions and the context of the situation gave them a weight and power that made them devastating assessments of O'Sullivan's judgment and assumptions and blindness to the changing reality of racial dynamics in America in 1943. O'Sullivan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He closed his mouth again, swallowed hard, tried again to speak, but failed again to produce any coherent answer to Bumpy's questions. After several seconds of this painful struggle, he simply shook his head and stared at his notepad apparently, deciding that silence was safer than attempting to defend or explain his segregation policies to the man who now controlled his economic future. Bumpy let the silence extend for another 10 seconds, before continuing. "I'm not asking these questions to humiliate you, Mr. O'Sullivan. I am asking because I want you to understand something important about the situation you're in now and about the situation that many white business owners in Harlem are going to find themselves in over the next few years as black people develop more economic power and more willingness to challenge the kind of discrimination that we've tolerated for too long. You thought you could operate a whites-only restaurant in Harlem indefinitely because you believed that property rights and white supremacy were permanent fixtures of American society that would never change in any meaningful way. But what you've failed to understand is that property rights are only as secure as the economic system that enforces them, and that economic system is changing rapidly as black people like me accumulate enough capital to buy buildings and businesses, and to exercise the same kind of economic power that white people have used for centuries to maintain racial hierarchies." Bumpy paused to let his words sink in, scanning the faces of white customers at nearby tables who were clearly listening to every word despite pretending to focus on their meals, noting the expressions of discomfort and resentment, and in some cases what might have been grudging respect for the strategic brilliance of buying the building rather than attempting to fight segregation through protests or lawsuits or other methods that would have taken years and might have failed. So here's what I propose, Mr. O'Sullivan. You can continue operating this restaurant under new lease terms that prohibit racial discrimination. You can adapt to serving both white and black customers with equal courtesy and professionalism. You can learn to see black patrons as valuable customers rather than as threats to your business or to the racial order you prefer. And if you do this successfully, if you genuinely commit to running an integrated establishment that treats all customers with respect, regardless of their race, then I'll be a fair landlord who collects rent and provides basic building maintenance and otherwise leaves you alone to operate your business as you see fit within those parameters. Or, alternatively, if you find that you simply cannot bring yourself to serve black customers without resentment, or if you decide that maintaining your segregationist principles is more important than keeping your business, then you can terminate your lease and vacate this property within 30 days. And I'll find a different tenant who will be happy to operate an integrated restaurant in this location and in this building that I now own. O'Sullivan finally found his voice, though it came out hoarse and strained. What would you like to order? The question was asked in a tone of complete surrender, an acknowledgement that arguing or resisting or attempting to assert his previous authority would be futile and possibly dangerous, a recognition that his only viable option was to comply with Bumpy's demands, and hope that he might eventually regain some measure of dignity and autonomy within the new reality that had been imposed on him through Bumpy's strategic use of economic power. Bumpy smiled again, the same small movement of lips that didn't reach his eyes, and proceeded to order dinner for himself and his 3 associates, selecting expensive items from the menu and specifying exactly how he wanted each dish prepared and which wines he wanted served with each course, exercising his rights as a customer in an establishment that 30 minutes earlier had tried to exclude him because of his race, but that now had no choice but to serve him with the same deference and attention that had previously been reserved exclusively for white patrons. While O'Sullivan wrote down the order with hands that still trembled slightly, Bumpy continued speaking in a voice that remained quiet but that carried easily to the nearby tables where white customers sat in various states of shock or outrage or reluctant acceptance of what they had just witnessed. I want to be clear about something else, Mr. O'Sullivan, something that everyone in this dining room should understand. What happened here tonight is not about revenge or about humiliating you personally or about punishing white people for the racism that black Americans have endured for centuries. This is about power and economics and the simple reality that segregation only works when black people do have the resources or the organization or the willingness to challenge it directly. I bought this building because I could afford to buy this building. I'm demanding integrated service because I have the economic leverage to enforce that demand. And I'm doing this publicly here in your restaurant with all of these white customers watching because I want everyone in Harlem to understand that the old arrangements are changing and that white business owners can no longer assume that they can discriminate with impunity just because custom and law have traditionally supported such discrimination. Property rights don't mean much when someone else owns the property, and racial hierarchies do mean much when the people who are supposed to be subordinate have more money and more power than the people who are supposed to be superior. The meal that followed was consumed in near total silence, with white customers eating quickly and leaving earlier than they had probably planned, unwilling to remain in a restaurant where they had just witnessed such a fundamental disruption of the racial order they were accustomed to, and uncomfortable with the idea of dining in the same room as black customers who were being served with the same quality of attention that white customers expected. Several patrons complained to O'Sullivan on their way out, expressing their displeasure with the new integrated seating policy and threatening to never return to the Crystal Room if he continued to serve black customers. Threats that O'Sullivan acknowledged with weak nods and vague promises that he would see what could be done, while clearly understanding that he had no power to change the situation and that his choice was between operating an integrated restaurant or losing his business entirely. Bumpy and his associates ate their dinner slowly and methodically, savoring each course and discussing various topics related to their business operations and to current events in Harlem and to the broader context of World War II and racial politics in America, their conversation quiet but animated, their demeanor relaxed and comfortable, their presence at the best table in the restaurant, serving as a visible demonstration that the Crystal Room was no longer a whites-only establishment, and that anyone who objected to integrated dining would need to find somewhere else to eat. By the time Bumpy and his associates finished their meal and paid their bill, leaving a 20% tip that was calculated to demonstrate both generosity and the understanding that O'Sullivan's staff deserved fair compensation regardless of the management's previous discrimination, approximately half of the white customers who had been in the restaurant when they arrived had left and only a handful of new customers had entered, suggesting that word was already spreading through Harlem's white nightlife crowd that the Crystal Room was no longer a safe space for people who wanted to maintain racial segregation in their dining experiences. O'Sullivan walked Bumpy to the door, his posture still defeated but his expression suggesting that he had begun to accept the new reality and to calculate how he might adapt his business to survive in an integrated format rather than continuing to fight a battle he had already lost. At the entrance, Bumpy stopped and turned to face O'Sullivan directly, his expression serious but not hostile. "I meant what I said about being a fair landlord if you choose to stay and operate this restaurant under the new terms. I have no interest in destroying your business or in making your life miserable, just because you held racist views that were unfortunately common among white people in 1943. What I am interested in is changing the material conditions that allow those racist views to translate into discriminatory practices that harm black people. So, if you decide to stay, to truly commit to serving all customers equally regardless of race, then we can have a productive business relationship. But if you can't do that, if your racism is so deep that you'd rather lose everything than serve black customers with genuine hospitality, then you should leave now and save us both the trouble of going through the eviction process." O'Sullivan stood silently for several seconds before responding in a voice that was quiet but steady. "I'll stay. I'll comply with the new lease terms. I'll serve whoever comes through that door." The words were delivered without enthusiasm or conviction, clearly motivated by economic necessity rather than any genuine change of heart about racial equality. But Bumpy nodded in acknowledgement because compliance motivated by self-interest was acceptable as a starting point, even if it was on the kind of enthusiastic embrace of integration that would have been ideal. "Good. You'll receive the formal lease amendment from my lawyers tomorrow morning. Read it carefully, sign it, return it within 5 business days, and understand that I or my representatives will be visiting this restaurant regularly to ensure that you re-honoring the non-discrimination clause. If I receive any credible reports that you refusing service to black customers or treating them differently than white customers, you'll receive an eviction notice within 24 hours, and you'll have 30 days to vacate. This is not negotiable, and this is not something you can fight in court because the lease terms are clear, and because I have the resources to litigate this matter for as long as necessary, if you choose to resist." Bumpy walked out of the Crystal Room, followed by his 3 associates, leaving O'Sullivan standing alone in the entrance of a restaurant that he had believed he controlled, but that he now understood belonged to someone else. Someone who had used economic power and strategic thinking to accomplish in one day what years of protests and lawsuits and political advocacy had failed to achieve in challenging Harlem's segregated business establishments. The story of what happened that night spread rapidly through Harlem and beyond, discussed in barbershops and churches and street corners, analyzed by civil rights activists who saw it as an example of how economic power could be leveraged to challenge discrimination more effectively than moral arguments or legal appeals to white conscience, and resented by white business owners throughout Harlem who realized that their assumptions about permanent white economic dominance were no longer justified, and that black residents were developing the kind of financial resources that could threaten segregationist practices that had seemed secure and unchangeable. The Crystal Room remained in operation for another 6 years, with O'Sullivan as its manager serving both white and black customers under the integrated policy that Bumpy had imposed, never becoming a particularly popular destination for either racial group, but continuing to generate enough revenue to pay rent and provide. O'Sullivan with a modest income until he finally sold his business in 1949 and moved back to Boston, where he hoped to escape the memory of the night when Bumpy Johnson silenced an entire room with a few quiet words, and a real estate transaction that demonstrated the power of economic leverage to transform racial dynamics, without requiring violence or extensive legal battles or the kind of gradual social change that often took generations to achieve meaningful progress.